There we go, better. Good afternoon. I work for the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and we are very interested in hearing about new technologies in the swine industry. I personally work with a lot of emergency response to swine diseases with foreign animal disease, and very happy to welcome you to learn more about some practical approaches to disease mitigation. So looking forward to this session and all of our speakers here today.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I will welcome our first speaker today, Dr. Sol Perez Aguirre-Urualde. Sol is a DBM and PhD, originally from Argentina, works as Deputy Director in the Center for Animal Health and Food Safety, who will be introducing our first presentation today related with experience on point-of-care test. Sol, thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for the introductions. And right now, my work is quite simple. I need to set the stage. All the presentations in this session are coming from a program that was funded by USDA APHIS for the National Program for Preparedness and Response. And these pilots, the evidence that we are going to be sharing with you in these sessions are coming from different collaborators within the US and in other locations in the world. So I'm going to just quickly remind us about the agenda, and then we'll jump into setting the stage for this conversation. Okay? So these are the names. You have the programs. We are going to have two of the slides, two of these presentations before the break, and then another two after the break. But the most fun part is going to be after my setting the stage. We are going to have an exercise, an interactive exercise that some of our colleagues are going to lead. So jumping into this, to set the stage today, we wanted to share a little of the current evidence related to point-of-care tests, specifically for African swine fever, but I think that some of the takeaways from the work that I'm going to be sharing is probably transferable to other transboundary diseases and other diseases in swine. So why we care, what we should keep caring about point-of-care testing related to ASF. I know that this year we have been very busy or very distracted with other new stuff. This bag had kept us learning about a new thing, but in the meantime, ASF kept being a headache across the world. So with over 15,000 outbreaks officially informed across the regions, and 56 countries that have officially reported this, that number probably would reach over 72 if we think about the countries that haven't reported their 6-month report to WOA by now. So we still have that reality across regions. We don't have a globally approved vaccine. And something of concern, and something that is picking up a lot of attention lately, is the spread of new variants. We are all aware of the new recombinant variant that is spreading throughout Asia, the recombinant between genotype 1 and 2, that is bringing headaches in terms of management of the disease, but also in terms of diagnostic. So, and all these pieces, we can summarize that is bringing a lot of challenges across regions, not only to the countries affected, but also the countries that may have the lack of not being affected yet, but they need to reshape and update their surveillance systems considering this pressure. So traditionally, obviously, the preparedness and early response of ASF has relied heavily in our traditional diagnostic platforms, right, which have worked really steadily. We have really high accuracy, and unfortunately, those are require, they are heavy in terms of infrastructure, in terms of operation, in terms of resources. In this scheme, since many years, since we started discussing globally the pressure of ASF when after the introduction of ASF in Asia, throughout China and the expansion, we start discussing that promising alternative of point-of-care test in enabling a faster or more readily available result to take action. Again, when we think about theoretically, those seems very promising, but when we start thinking about how those new platforms should be assessed, we need to think about how really in practical sense. So in terms of fitness of purpose, that is something that was established from the beginning, the idea of having validation tests specifically to well-defined conditions, how we are going to set a path to validate a specific diagnostic platforms that should be useful in a specific field conditions. Okay, so when we're thinking about fitness of purpose, then in the context of point-of-care test, we need to realize that sometimes we tend to simplify what we are meaning about point-of-care test. There is a lot that gets under the umbrella of point-of-care test, and when we think about the definition, we are thinking about a diagnostic that would be easily deployable and that can give us actionable results, right? And under that definition, there has been a lot of development in the last 10 years. So when we think about platforms available for diagnostic, for describe as point-of-care test, we are thinking about the comparison of a traditional diagnostic pathway that you can see on the top of the diagram, that we are thinking about a sample that is transported to a lab setting and then is pre-conditioned, then process it, and then there is a whole process in terms of how we capture that result. That result is reported back, we analyze, and then in comparison, ideally, we are thinking about a test that will give us a result, trusted result in the field in a very short period of time, and that could trigger that decision making. That is where the tricky part of how we make that happen, of in what conditions that would be possible, it started happening. So just as a reminder, we are not going to go in deeper in regarding this in these slides, but when we think about point-of-care tests, we're thinking about a lot of current platforms available there that are not only detecting antigen comparatively to ELISA tests, but also antibodies, and obviously there is a huge development of different alternatives and platforms that are going into terms of DNA detection that are currently in development. So what we wanted to do is summarize and try to understand what is out there, what is the current evidence. So we performed a scoping review throughout the period of 2014-2024 from a huge amount of records that were retrieved. We include, after an exclusion process, we included 119 articles, and then we apply a fit reassure framework that we published a couple of years ago. That was an adaptation of the reassure framework that was developed for evaluation of point-of-care tests in public health. And when we think about that, the most important thing that we wanted to bring is we are not only going to be capturing the information regarding accuracy, and particularly, but the other elements, the other features that we should have in mind when we think about point-of-care tests to be implemented in a real setting. So we have equipment needs, deliverability, robustness, user-friendly, affordability. So all those parameters were captured in this lead review. So just to tell you a little about the results, and again, we had to choose a handful of the main pieces. As you can see, the distribution of these articles, the numbers may be small, but as I mentioned, we have retrieved 119 articles. This is the distribution. So things were quite quiet until the end of 2019. That means that all the interest in terms of shifting platforms, potential platforms of point-of-care tests for ASF really started in 2019, and that is connected with the wave of expansion of ASF in the Asian continent, and that also is clearly justified when we think about the origin of all these publications. Over 70% of those are coming from Asia. Okay, so in terms of how we decide how we wanted to organize this and to structure these results. So we use this pathway. If we think about this is based on the pathway of development of diagnostic tests implemented by WHO, and then we adapted some of these definitions and trying to describe what would be the ideal pathway of how a point-of-care test from evaluation of feasibility at lab base could be actually be reach registration and then potentially endorsed by WOA. So you can see the the three phases that we're going to be discussing in the next few slides is development, feasibility, and evaluation. And each of these is described as development, just a concept of a prototype that is fully lab-based and it's just saying this could potentially work. It has a lot of ifs. Then we have feasibility when we are thinking about, okay, this, even at lab level, we are testing this with actual samples and we have reached a first point of analytical validation. And then evaluation is when we felt comfortable enough to push that evaluation of that point of care test into the field. When we assess the articles of this review, based on that, we see that it was as we expected. There is a decline. Obviously, there is a lot of excitement. There is a lot of momentum in the literature regarding potential prototypes of fancy diagnostic platforms. So those are over 50% of these articles are describing just prototypes that at some point say these could be potentially useful in the field, but not much happen. Then feasibility is interesting. There is different stages of validation at lab level of these platforms. So we have 40% of these articles describing these results, and unfortunately only less than 8% of these reports are actually capturing activities in terms of trying to take these platforms into the field. Okay, so otherwise I will keep adding time. So briefly, just as I mentioned, and hopefully in a few months you should be able to consume the results of the published article. But briefly, the results of the platform, the technological platforms that we evaluate across these reports, we classified in 9 categories. The 3 more frequent took over 82% of these reports, being PCR and lateral flow, the most mature platforms, taking almost 30%, 35% in total, and then actually isothermal tests that are coming really in the few last years as a very promising tool, took over 59% of the reports. Unfortunately, if we dive a little deeper, even the platforms that are more mature, that we have been around for longer, and we should have seen more reports of things moving into the field, those are actually from PCR and lateral flow articles, less than a third of the articles reporting these results were beyond the development. So that keeps demonstrating the bottleneck, right, that we have in terms of this pipeline of development from very promising technologies, maybe at lab level, to something actually happening in the field. And when we think about, even we go beyond there and see about the alignment of this kind of framework that invite us to think about beyond accuracy in terms of, okay, obviously accuracy, we need to care about accuracy, but we need to think about what are the other critical features that we want to evaluate when we think about something that could be potentially deployable in the field. We need, then there is really a lack of evidence in the reports out there. So while 98% of the studies reported somehow describe some level of accuracy, and I will put it between brackets because then we can discuss longer in terms of what the quality of those reports in terms of accuracy, sensitivity, and specificity. But then we see a significant drop of how those reports deal with things such as turnaround time, portability, and also user-friendliness. And particularly the user-friendliness and the robustness of the of the test is something that has been very scattered in the literature. So, based on, and now I'm just jumping into maybe some conclusions, and I wish to have much longer to share some of the extra results, but again, I think that as key elements that should support us to keep exploring point-of-care tests in this context is the rapid detection has been documented, and I think that that is the case. Accuracy is there. We are getting really good, robust technology, at least at an analytical level, right? So now, obviously, there is a very appealing message in terms of accessibility in some settings where access to diagnostic services is very limited. The opportunity to have something that is more flexible and adaptable, I think that that is having a lot of traction in the literature. Is still not many of these articles are describing how these benefits in terms of quantifying the opportunity, the benefits between the traditional platforms and these newly adapted platforms. Then we always talk about cost. It's true, some of the platforms out there could be potentially justify cost savings. Unfortunately, there is that also, those claims are quite lightly supported by evidence and studies behind. So in terms of really have, it's a missed opportunity, I think, the amount of work that may have happened and the lack of some of those details that could actually make a more robust case in terms of moving forward some of these platforms. And of course, the idea of user-friendliness, how to properly evaluate and assess the need of certain level of training to implement, and that is quite connected to something that I will highlight in the next slide, that is how we think about quality assurance in the context of point-of-care tests. So what holds us back now from point-of-care tests, at least for ASF, and I think that broadly, is the validation gaps. We still have an overly focus on analytical accuracy in the literature, so there is really limited reports on field-level assessments. Replacement mindset, I don't know, hopefully that makes sense. It's truly the justification that most of in these reports come up is the idea of point-of-care tests to replace traditional platforms. And I don't think that that should be the goal. I think that we need to think about how we complement current diagnostic algorithms in a way that would make them more robust, more versatile, but still we need to rely heavily on those traditional platforms. And of course, the lack of currently frameworks to evaluate quality assurance in this space where we can accreditate the field, right? So how we rethink the quality assurance space when thinking about implementing this kind of test within the context of official control programs or strategies. So finally, just a few takeaways. I think that the pipeline is innovative, but it's still, let's call it immature, fit for purpose. I think that we need to keep balancing the idea of how we report accuracy compared to the other features. And of course, I think that we need to start taking more and more opportunities to assess the implementation of these tools in the actual setting that we are expecting those to be based. So with no more, thank you so much. And obviously, I would acknowledge our funding source, the USDA EFIS, and I will welcome any question before jumping into and passing it to the rest of the team. Thank you.
Thank you, Sol. Are there questions for Sol? Sol, you mentioned briefly that there has been quite excitement in the use of new technology, but that you don't think that the final goal should be to replace more established or standardized, officially approved techniques. What would be then the motivation for developing this type of tests if the final goal is not to replace what may not be working?
Okay, good question. I don't think, I think that we can partially replace it. I think that not all the samples should be processed by real-time PCR. I think that, well, I think that in a few presentations we are going to make a case in terms of how the bottlenecks create in terms of if we think about a full early response and surveillance strategy in a country that is impacted by a transboundary disease, if everything goes through the traditional pathway, we are going to hit in the surge capacity of those labs. Now, obviously, when we have these conversations with the veterinary authorities in some countries, they say, well, I need to have an accredited result to be able to feel that whatever I'm reporting to WOA is supported by those conditions. And right now, a field test won't be able to support that reporting. So we need to back up the reporting. I think that should be a confirmatory role, but if we could make decisions faster in certain conditions, and then to have confirmatory steps, that could be in many of the situations, and we are like bringing this, and it's very different thinking about surveillance in a country where ASF is exotic compared to a country that is actually dealing with an endemic situation, right? So different diagnosis. But I think that the idea that the point of care test will ever behave as a real-time PCR, let's call it as our goal. I think that we are setting up for failure if we are just pushing into that.
Okay, thank you. We have a question.
Does WOA recognize any point-of-care tests as officially useful or used?
Yes, that is a really good question. Yes, there is currently, and my colleague Silver could correct me, there are 6. Oh, see, yes, sorry. The question there was if WOA had recognized any point-of-care test for ASF. Yes, there are currently 6 kits. Maybe there are 7, but otherwise we are around there, that have been endorsed for a specific pieces. But most of that validation, even listed in the WOA site, is presented as validated at lab level. The only 2 that I have knowledge about that have been utilized for in the field have been for antibody testing, right? And that is a kit in Spain for the surveillance program. But right now, there have not been implemented in the field. As far as I know, neither of these 6 platforms.
So I guess the follow-up question is, how can we expect to get any use approved when we can't get our regulatory bodies to move on that decision?
So I think that the regulatory body, I think that the validation piece that WOA usually, first of all, WOA won't say we can use this or not. They are going to build recommendations in how countries should validate their diagnostic tests to fulfill certain requirements in terms of between countries, right? So that is, I think that in the case of WOA, had built certain recommendations in how to try to inform the validation, the fit for purpose in terms of point of care test. I think that there has been not many efforts to reach that validation for some of for example, I don't think that the commercial platforms available today have been, most of the ones that are available, for example, in Asia, have gone through that pathway because they are being utilized without that WOA endorsement. I think that the way that they are being utilized, it's outside that endorsement. I think that to build those endorsements, we need to start building more what would be the pathway where veterinary authorities will pick up these tools and potentially utilize it within their surveillance system.
A quick question. You mentioned early on about the emerging variants, and
Yes.
what kind of challenge does that pose for these types of, point of care tests and things like that, where things are changing, right? And you have to. Is that a big deal, or is that a big challenge?
I think that it would be a big deal, like any other molecular diagnostics that need to keep even the recommended or validated PCR platforms we need to have those in mind, need to be assessed in terms of the new variants. I think that there is work done, particularly with the genotype 1 and genotype 2 in terms of the current PCR, but there was a report from Vietnam from 2-3 years ago where they actually adapted their PCR because they determined that they weren't picking everything that was kind of in the field. I think that for the platforms, when we are thinking about point-of-care platforms, that will be depending in the principles behind each of these platforms. Because as I mentioned, there are like multiple strategies, and one of the ideas is to try to understand how that quality assurance piece that is much clearer when we're thinking about how a traditional lab takes care of those potential changes, how those steps should, how we address those questions in a platform that we are not having, that we are maybe implementing in the field, that we are not having the same structure behind. But I think that means that, in my opinion, that is where the traditional platforms need to be supporting in the potential performance of these diagnostics if whatever is circulating in the field change.
Just one more question. When it comes to, I guess part of the discussion has been, right, about this is a preemptive type test, right? Do you feel like the cost that would be involved with this kind of a test would be, would make it so that if ultimately you're going to have a PCR test anyways, right? If you're even close to positive or positive, I guess, is it possible, I guess what I'm trying to say is to make these cost effective so they are a kind of a way to monitor your herd? I'm just thinking about like in mastitis, right? Like for dairy cows, they have all these cow side tests, right? And they're inexpensive, right? So then if you do have a problem, you send it off to the lab and find out what you have so you know what kind of antibiotic to give or whatever. Is cost going to be a limiting factor, I guess, is the question?
Good question. I am not an expert in that aspect, so I will just give you my 2 cents of what I think. I think that, as I mentioned, we are describing point-of-care tests, very different platforms. And some of these platforms bring a cost benefit that is much clearer than other platforms that seems that the benefits is more relying in other features of that platform. I think that also depends in terms of, when you mention mastitis and the potential of monitoring things, that maybe touch a nerve in terms of how the regulatory framework, how that monitoring will take place when we are talking about reportable disease, right? And who does what. Now, when we are thinking, and these are preliminary results, but what we are seeing in endemic countries is that these tools could support a much timely response at the same time that reducing cost, thinking about the sustainability of their surveillance system.
Okay, thank you so much.